Good morning, everyone. It's our pleasure at SLU Global to host this seminar together with Urban Futures. SLU Global is a unit in the Vice Chancellor's office with a mission to support SLU's work for global development. And we do this jointly with partners based in low-income contexts. And urban sustainability is one of SLU's 6 priorities for our global contribution to Agenda 2030. And to accelerate this work, we at the SLU Global partner with Urban Futures. And this seminar today is one of several activities that we organized this year to deepen the conversation around urban sustainability in a low-income context. And today's specific focus on informal settlements and the more inclusive urban agenda is crucial to progress towards SDG 11. And the progress is, however, far too slow, as we all know, and the pandemic has really exposed the vulnerabilities of informal settlements. But it has also been said that the crisis offers opportunities to reimagine urban areas as hubs of inclusive development. And events like this seminar today are really important for bringing together different actors and help us rethink and explore opportunities for transdisciplinary collaboration to tackle the complex challenges that we face. And with that, I hand over back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to quickly go through the agenda. But before that, I just wanted to introduce a bit, like you said, Sarah, today's seminar is important because today we have an estimated 25% of the world's population living in informal settlements. And questions still remain about how the world will achieve its ambitions for creating a fairer and more sustainable society in relation to both planning but rapid urbanization in our cities. And today's guests are experts in their field and will be discussing some of these issues relating to urbanization and environmental change in the context of informal settlements. So I'd like to welcome our guests and introduce them briefly. We have Dr. Selma Karuahe, Senior Lecturer at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and President of the African Association of Environmental and Resource Economists and Associate Coordinator of the South African SDG Hub. We also have Donovan Story, Head of Global Policy and Influence at Riel. And we have Paula Ledo, who is a researcher at the Department of Urban and Rural Development at SLU, but also CPLAG in Bolivia. University in Bolivia. And we have, last but not least, Johan Enqvist, which he's a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre and also the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. So welcome everyone. As today's seminar is fairly short, I want to dive straight into our presentations, and the presentations from each speaker will be around 8 minutes. And after each of the two, we'll go through 2 presentations and there'll be a short Q&A section after each 2 presentations. So please, during the presentations, write your comments and questions in the chat if you have any for our speakers, and we can try and get through as many as we can. And also maybe if we have time at the end, we can pick up some further questions. So I'm going to start and dive right in to Selma's presentation. So I hand over to Dr. Selma. Oh, sorry, that was just the agenda that I briefly went through there. To Selma Karuahe. Welcome, Selma. You're on mute, Selma. We still can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? No, we don't hear you. There we go.
Sorry, yes, the usual mute story. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Selma Karoye. I'm, as Andrew has introduced me, I am with the University of Pretoria. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Extension and Rural Development. And Andrew, I just wanted to check, because there are some of my guests who are asking for a link and they registered. Could there be any issues with that? He said he registered, but he doesn't have a link. It's taking him somewhere else. Sorry to take the minutes.
It seems to be working because we have participants joined. I recommend maybe going in and registering again and using the link to join because it's still open.
Oh, okay, maybe they can do that. All right. Okay. All right. One of my other responsibilities is I'm also the president of the African Association for Environmental and Resource Economists. And some of the duties we do, which is part of the universities here, I'm also participating in the South African SDG Hub, which is based here at the University of Pretoria. So I think by way of introduction, that's what I can say who I am. And greetings from Southern Africa. It's nice to meet you all. Some of the faces are familiar, but some are meeting for the first time, and it's nice to meet you. Thank you. You can move forward. Somehow the presentation on my screen is cutting. Is it showing full on your side?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, now it's better, yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this morning I would like to briefly share with you some case study that I did. I mean, it's a study that I did some years back, and it's actually in Windhoek, Namibia, where we looked at different methods of water access for the urban poor in the informal settlements of Windhoek, Namibia. So then I will also try to look at the relationships between the different institutions, especially the community institutions, and how they manage the different water resources. But for our study, our focus was on water access. And I will also share some existing policies in terms of what is there for Namibia. And then we could learn from each other. And the main, also try to identify the main constraints that actually affect access to services for these communities. Next. Now, in terms of background, Namibia got its independence. I think it's among the last colonies in Africa. It got its independence in 1990. And prior to that, during the colonial regimes, which was first during the German and then the South African regime, there was no formal recognition of informal settlements the way we know them today. And in fact, informal settlements resulted from after independence, when people started moving away from the concentrated areas, because some people were confined to certain areas, and therefore after independence, they needed to actually find a place, and given their low income, they could not afford to live in the formal setups, and that's how informal settlements emerged. The other one was rural urban migration, where people now started moving from the so-called reservations, which were there during the apartheid regime, coming to the big cities in search for better hopes, better lives. And the emergence of specifically the Windhoek informal settlements was after the upgrading of this, there was an area which was also demarcated for labor supply called the single quarters. And then that was, some of that was converted into formal settlements, but then some people also needed to move away from those formal settlements to find a place. And another thing, which was the main thing, which was also found by other studies, was really the rural urban migration, which led to a 40% increase in the people moving into informal settlements. But the reality is that until today, those people living in informal settlements don't own the land, but for them to access the services, land ownership, access private individual services, they need to have ownership of the land. So that is actually the challenge that people are facing today. Now, I don't need to take you through what the informal settlements are in terms of definitions, but I think just for a recap, just for us to appreciate and what kind of setups we are talking about, because these are people who live with no security of tenure on the land they inhabit, and there's squatting or having informal rental options. The neighborhood usually lacks basic services or city infrastructure, and the housing may not even comply with the planning and building regulations. And this is very typical across all developing countries. And this is also common in Namibia, as you'll see from some of the other pictures that I'll show. Now, there are limited number of studies that have been conducted on Windhoek specific, but ours was focusing on the water services. Now, our study used a sample frame from the Central Bureau of Statistics, because by the time, and that was back when I was doing my PhD in 2004, I needed to enter the informal settlements. But I mean, when you go to these areas, there is no planning in terms of, you wouldn't know where to start in terms of conducting the survey. So therefore, I needed to have the maps from the census office so that, and they had some numbers of the stands, the plots, and that actually helped me to be able to identify them for me to do the sampling, and that is what I used in terms of the sampling methods. This was part of a bigger study that looked at water connections in Windhoek, which was over 300 or 400 households, but specifically for this, the informal settlements, the households were about 97 households that I interviewed in Windhoek. So one would wonder, why are you sharing experience of 2004 now? And the reality is that while the study might be old in terms of when it was conducted, the challenges remain the same with very little progress made. So we talked to households, we talked to community leaders, and we also talked to municipality officials. Now, the maps you are seeing here might be a bit outdated, but these are, these are some of the settlements in Windhoek. Some are formal, but also within those formal settlements, you'll find that some have some informal settlements. So the one on the right are the informal settlements that I included in my survey. But of course, today now they have emerged, and there are much more number of informal settlements in Windhoek than from the time I conducted the study. Now, the main finding at that point in time was the municipality used to charge a flat rate for communal water points. So basically, people did not have private connections in their homes. They will go queue at a public water point. But then in terms of, but the municipality will give them a lifeline. The first 6 cubic meters was given for free as part of the government policy to improve access to these services. But then communities, because they did not receive an individual bill, they had to contribute for all the households who belong to a certain communal water point. So households were contributing a $20 contribution per household. Now, a dollar exchange rate is, I think $1 is equals to probably around 13, 15 Namibian dollars, which is the same as the rent today. So that is how much they contributed. And what happens is that there were also a few who were using a prepaid meter card. So those ones will then buy water in advance, like the way we buy airtime, and then you'll go to a water point and access water using the units that you filled on your card. Now, what is interesting to know is that yesterday, I was talking to one of the water point committees. I found some contacts of people there. And in fact, in 2021, people are more or less still paying between $30 and $50, that's Namibian dollars, to access water. But in this case now, it has moved away from the communal water points to the prepaid meter cards. So which means people are no longer having to be administered at the water point by a water point committee, but they actually have to use the card to access the water. Now, the main function of the water point committee was really to coordinate meetings for the communities and to also act as a voice between the communities and the city council. And what was interesting there is that you find that communities sometimes have to pay, once they collect the $20 amount, they have to input that money with the city council, irrespective of the bill. Sometimes it could be more, sometimes it could be less, which in the end, one would interpret it as savings, because that's what they were saying, that in times when they have a shortfall, then the city will not charge them and they will take it from there. So that was the kind of arrangements that was happening back then.
Just to let you know, Salma, the eight minutes is almost up now. So
yeah, if you could move a bit, yeah. You can move on, yes. So the pictures I'm showing here, in fact, this is me in 2004. This is the prepaid meter system that was used then. And now this is how the prepaid meter system looks like. Just to say the emergence between then and now. You can move on. So what are the key findings that we drew from this lesson is that the majority of the population in the informal settlements have limited access to public services, just like the definition I started with. And in fact, what we found in our study is that most of the communities did not own the land. In fact, none of them still today owns the land, but there was a 15% of those households who were leasing the land from the municipality. And I think this is one of the key findings, because what happens is that the people understood the lease to be payment towards owning plots one day, but the municipality was actually having a different understanding. And when I was talking to the community leader yesterday, that amount is now 114, and they still continue to pay without actually having been upgraded to a formal settlement. So and what was also important from the finding is that the communities found land ownership is more important than access to any other services. So their interest was more to pay towards the land payment than owning having access to water and other things. To them, that was a secondary need. If you can move on. And here I'm just trying to show the progression when I'm talking of little progress. This is me in 2004. You see the informal settlements on the left. This is in 2014. And this is, so what has happened is more of a congestion and an increase in the number of informal settlers. But in terms of development, not much has happened. You can move on. So what led to this problem? The problem is really the unclear policy, because what is happening is that City Council needs to upgrade settlements into formal settlements for people to move away so that they can actually have a title deed. Now, the thing is, the informal settlers, the reason they removed their one was because they are poor. They can't afford to own, to buy land, say, for example, or to pay a huge amount of rent. So somehow the situation, the City Council is complacent with the current status quo, because for them, they get the money in terms of the services they provide, which is income for the water services that they're providing, with little other in terms of sanitation and so forth. And in fact, the only upgrade that has happened, as I was talking to the community leader, is that now those who are so-called leasing plots from the municipality, at least last year, they got access to electricity. So the City Council felt that at least we have to improve the services of these people so that they can have one additional service that they can have in their homes, which is prepaid electricity. Now, the challenge with policy is because council can only upgrade the settlement in terms of putting up roads, infrastructure, and so forth, but it cannot, is not the one in charge of building houses, for example. So there is a need to bring other stakeholders on board. I think you can move on as well. To bring other stakeholders on board that can show that, that can contribute, that can help these poor settlers in terms of maybe access to an informal loan, if one may put it that way, or an arrangement, because like the understanding they had when they were paying the lease amount of 85 rands or $85 back then, was for them to contribute up to a certain amount, which can serve as a deposit towards, as a collateral towards them buying land as a group, which means that at least they could own land as a group and they could put now their formal structures, they could start building, because that can serve as a collateral towards a formal loan. But since the formalization of the land has not really been implemented, government has gone through these different policies in terms of the flexible land tenure, in terms of the Regional and Urban Planning Act, but still this is where we are. In fact, what government did this year, was it last year, was to give people a certificate of acknowledgement of occupation. So this means that at least you can occupy the plot where you are, But that is how far we can go, because we can't give you a title deed. So people now can use that to go buy water, for example, because now they are registered in the plot, but they still don't have the access to the services.
Can you just wrap up quickly now, Salma?
Yes, that I think that is the end. If you move to, yeah, I have said a lot of what was, I mean, in terms of the conclusion. So really, that is the challenge that we are facing, to say that the informal settlers, they are having limited access to the services, but also their informality is denying them to be upgraded to formal structures, which creates a complacency for the policymakers, because the status quo is more convenient than moving out. But in reality, people really want to own the land they stay on, so that they can upgrade their livelihood. And I think that is where I could end, because when we talk of the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 agenda of leaving no one behind, I think the informal settlers have a long way to be entered in terms of improving their livelihood, and governments need to do something towards that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Salma. And with that, I'd like to hand over, fitting quite nicely into Donovan's story, from Rial, who's going to talk about meeting the affordable housing crisis by investing in change. So welcome, Donovan. Oops. There we go.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Salma. I really enjoyed that presentation. It's fantastic. My one sort of shifts to a different, I guess, strategy, but I think probably sharing the same endeavors and struggles and outcomes as well. But if I can just build upon that. So yes, I'm representing Real, which was based in the UK, but we work in the global south, in particular with 5 priority countries. And the title is Meeting the Affordable Housing Crisis Through Investing in Change. So change it there, Andrew. So just very briefly on our approach is a mix of build and broker. So you can see our network there. But essentially, we use our build strategy, and we work with partners in our partner countries, in particular our 5 priority countries, but also beyond, developers and builders, in focusing on the housing needs of the bottom 40% of the market. So we refer to what we refer to as the bottom 40%, with the goal of packing as much into what we define as affordable housing for our target market of no more than $10,000 US. But we also focus very much, and I think Selma sort of spoke to this a little bit, in terms of brokering. That is that, you know, our build strategy can only be so successful if we're not able to then take that as a proof of concept, and then to be able to crowd in other actors, both public and private sector actors, to be able to demonstrate that you can achieve affordable housing at scale. And as you'll see through the presentation, increasingly having those housing options as being climate smart and affordable as well. Next slide, Andrew. So that's our impact in numbers, and I'll talk a little bit about our evolution as an organisation in a moment, but essentially focusing on getting access to greater security of tenure, whatever that along that spectrum of security is enough to trigger housing and service access. It's about focusing on the WASH agenda. It's about focusing particularly on sanitation and water provision, and increasingly on climate smart and low carbon opportunities as well. And we ourselves, through our build program, you know, that's a small, if you like, fraction of the housing solutions that we're trying to bring to the table, because fundamentally it's about bringing in other actors and demonstrating to them that this is an incredibly important market, not only in terms of meeting desperately needed housing gaps, but also addressing it in a way which ticks as many of the boxes of being sustainable and inclusive as well. Next slide, Andrew. This is the challenge. Selma has perfectly really framed this in the context of Namibia, and we know these figures very well, but I think they're always very sobering to put back up in terms of where we are positioned with respect to the housing challenges which are ongoing, but also the projections which we'll face going forward, and therefore a sense of greater urgency in doing things, I would argue, doing things differently to what we've done in the past, because I think we're in danger of repeating the same kinds of solutions to existing problems and coming out with the same outcomes, which are essentially an increased global housing crisis, affordable and relevant housing to what the need is. And so we do need to think differently. We do need to shift our approaches. So we can see that in terms of the projections with those living in slum or slum-like conditions using UN Habitat's typology. We know that there's an increasing affordability crisis globally, particularly felt in the global south, and we can see some of those numbers in terms of that gap. We also know that the housing issue has been a public and a private sector failure. Simply put, public housing cannot meet the demand at the price point required and hasn't succeeded in bringing about the change that's required through public finances, which can be very, very weak, as we know, particularly at the municipality level. And there's also been a private sector failure, a market failure, in terms of the market not addressing what the need is at a level of affordability and the type of housing that's required to support people. We also know, and this is another way of thinking about it, that it's a development success story in terms of meeting the needs of the bottom 40%. With Real's own background as previously Homeless International, very much focused on slum upgrading and the very poorest. But we know now that there's a demand coming from those that are escaping absolute poverty, that are successfully graduating, if you like, of the leaving no one behind and poverty eradication work of the past few decades now. But these people are coming into a housing context in which they can afford to have options outside of the very poorest shelter situations, but there's nothing to move into. There is simply an absence of lower middle income and upper poor income housing stock that's available. There is a massive gap between, if you like, the housing possibilities in slums and informal settlements and what the private sector is offering, sometimes in the tens of thousands of dollars. So it's in that space that Real has moved, those people graduating through poverty and into an environment, though, in which their housing needs are not being met. So it's a development success in some respects in terms of the challenges of meeting the needs of this growing population, particularly in Africa and in South Asia as well. We also know that it's a challenge because a house is much more than a physical structure, right? And Selma spoke to this. A house unlocks and derives its relevance for people in terms of land access, in terms of access to servicing, in terms of access to finance. And we also know that another challenge, which I'll speak to in a minute, is this formal-informal binary, which I think we increasingly need to move away from. And that's been a major problem in terms of housing provision and approaches to housing, is seeing things in these informal-formal binaries. And for those of us lucky enough to have quite a bit of experience in the Global South, we know that such binaries at the level of people's lived experience are not really there to a great extent, but they're created by systems and institutions. And we also know the final challenge there is that, you know, we need to develop solutions to people's housing needs in a very narrow affordability space. People do not have a great proportion of their income to dedicate to housing solutions. And this is one of the great challenges that we need to meet through creativity and integration as well. Next slide, Andrew. So I'm going to focus my final 3 slides on what I refer to as investing in place, investing in people, and investing in the planet, which is kind of my way of summarizing our work and our approach. Some of these things I've already discussed a little bit in the introduction. So one of the key things is we need to meet local housing challenges through local solutions and change makers. We simply can't we can't bring outside solutions, products at a scale that's needed, which is going to find fertile ground at a local level. And there is, as we know, across Africa and Asia, where we primarily work, a huge amount of creative industry, of entrepreneurship, of investment, of ideas. So one of the Real's major sort of business models, if you like, or our approaches to finding solutions is to invest in local partners to solve local challenges. And I think that that's an investment in place. Also supporting, beyond the houses, I talked about as seeing the house as fundamentally about inclusion. It's about access to other goods and services. Thinking about the home in its broader context and with regards to its integration to wider urban society and services and infrastructure, understanding particularly that a house is only effective if it is also a means to an end for people, and to understand the importance of placemaking in that regard. But finally, also investing in place is about investing in policy. And we've seen quite a shift in some key African countries. Affordable housing is one of the big 4 focus areas of the Kenya government. There's been quite a few shifts recently in places such as Ghana and Rwanda on affordable and green building materials, and looking at building codes again to create more flexibility and creativity for new businesses and SMEs, African SMEs in particular. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of those, but essentially there are policy impediments there that Summer has pointed to, which we must address at the same time. And you can't address those from the outside. Investing in people, this is fundamentally about the finance barrier which is faced. We work with the bottom 40%, and fundamentally they're locked out of investing in their own housing futures. They cannot access formal sources of finance. They cannot access finance in a way which is relevant to their needs and their backgrounds. We find in particular a huge gap between finance that is available, for formal finance which is available through the banking and other formal systems, which can't find places to invest. And yet we have this enormous need at the level of people coming out, or who are in poverty or coming out of poverty, a need for that finance. And we have this fundamental gap between the two of them. It's that gap that we must fill. So there's a mismatch between finance and people, which is really evident in housing in the global south. And part of our strategy is to close that gap, is to invest in a lot of innovative ideas, particularly in Asia. We've had a lot of fantastic successes in recognizing informality in people's incomes as being bankable. So Sintellect in particular has done a lot of really interesting work out of India in terms of creating an app, creating, if you like, a digital footprint of people's informal incomes, which in essence helps investors understand people's incomes and the fact that they are not a risky investment in terms of access to finance. So there's a lot of really interesting around financial innovation and technology of what we refer to as rationalizing risk. That is creating bankable communities which previously have not been touched by the formal financial sector. The final one is investing in the planet. And that is that we need to make sure increasingly that our solutions don't create a future crisis. And so in dealing with affordable housing needs, we simply can't continue to whack up concrete buildings with tin roofs at a mass scale and the scale that's required. That just creates the potential for the future climate crisis and resilience crisis, in which the poor will be on the front line of that. So it makes no sense anymore to invest in old technologies, materials, and structures. So there are, as I said, a lot of great innovations, particularly in Asia and Africa, on climate smart materials, on climate smart infrastructure, on nature-based solutions in terms of placemaking, which we need to now integrate into affordable housing solutions. And we need to essentially lock in infrastructure for the future and meeting global housing needs in a way which supports the climate agenda, the Paris Agreement, and the resilience agenda as well. And it is possible, and it is something that we are working on a lot with developers and partners in the developing world. There are a lot of, you can see some of the logos of the organizations that we work with, and we also work with the IFC through EDGE certification now on affordable housing, which I think 5 years ago people would not have thought was relevant or affordable, but increasingly our housing solutions at an affordable scale have some degree of EDGE certification in terms of meeting needs with resource efficiency, particularly energy efficiency and water efficiency. Final slide is really just a thank you, and also acknowledging our partners in CEDA and also UK Aid over the years, and look forward to connecting with the range of people and continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Donovan. I think since we're short on time, we've gone a bit over. I'm going to move straight into the next presentation, and perhaps if there's any questions, we can try and incorporate them into the panel discussion. So I'm going to hand straight over to Paula Ledo, who's going to talk about the issue of participatory planning and take the angle on this topic. We can't hear you there, Paula. No, unfortunately, it seems it's not working.
Now is it working?
Yes, it's working now.
Okay, I'm sorry for that. So I'm going to present you in 8 minutes. I'll try to present the research I did in my PhD. And this is a case study that I did in Bolivia. Next slide, please, Andrew. And yeah, Bolivia in South America. And I did my research, next slide, in the third biggest city of Bolivia, which is called Cochabamba. And in Cochabamba, 75% or more of population lives in this small urban sprawl in the metropolitan area. And next slide. This sprawl covers the territory of 7 municipalities, one of which is Sacaba, and this is where my case study was based on. Sacaba is an interesting case because it's in Cochabamba, the municipality that has the highest rate of urban growth, but also is among the top 5 municipalities of Bolivia that has been growing the fastest since 2012. And next slide. What is interesting about this is that all this fast growth has been happening in the peri-urban area, in the outskirts of the formal urban area, and therefore it's in informal conditions. Next. As you may see in this map, the urban sprawl is quite extensive, but also has a very wide difference of population density. And most of it has a very low density. And this is because most of it, next, is not being planned. As you can see in this map, the yellow part of the urban sprawl is actually informal occupation. What does this mean is that, next, is that the way the city looks, it's more or less like this. It's like a mix between old houses and new edifications, but very in precarious conditions, mixed with agricultural activities still. Next slide. So as I was saying, these are the kind of new houses that are being built that do not count with basic services or whatsoever. And at the same time, you can see in the same neighborhood, next, houses, next slide, please. Houses like this that are more traditional from the countryside, that are very old and with agricultural activities and farming activities. Next slide, please. So in these areas, the municipal capacity to cope with the growth and to provide basic services and social services have being limited, and most of the living of these settlers are handled by informality and insurgency of the settlers. In all aspects, in the terms of housing and land market, there is a lot of informal and illegal offers, like you will see in the pictures, that people selling land in rural areas where it's not where it's not allowed to do so, but the price is 10 times cheaper than in the formal urban area. Next slide. Also, in terms of economic activities, more than 80% of the population is employed in informal activities, such as commerce. Women in the metropolitan area, they go around the flea markets of all the metropolis. And for men, it's transportation, also around the metropolitan area. These activities are based on daily incomes that vary from day to day. They don't have any security or social services. Next slide, please. And in terms of basic provision, also there is no public service that has reached this area. Public services only reach 15% of the total urban sprawl of the municipality. So what settlers do is that they find their ways of coping with it, whether it's collecting water in tanks and digging their own wells, or deciding to dispose the garbage next to the rivers and these kind of things. These kind of activities that the peri-urban settlers carry on to support their survival, their lives, it's in constraint with urban planners. And it shows this conflict of rationality that authors from the Southern turn in planning talk about, that show that urban planning, as we know it, the conventional urban planning does not foresee the actual reality of cities of the global south that are pretty much carry on informal and insurgent strategies of surviving. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's what I was saying. The next slide. So in the case of Bolivia, urban planning, the rationality that follows, it's a participatory planning model that has been implemented since the 1990s. But at the beginning, it was planners were trying to implement a participatory model that the World Bank was promoting in the country. And of course, as in many other southern cities have happened, in practice, the participatory model did not work. It suffered a process of adaptation to this local socioeconomic context, the political context, the ethos of the planners at that time, and other internal and external changes that were happening in Bolivia. And in this process of adaptation, a very specific culture of what participatory planning has been created. Next slide, please. In this culture of participatory planning, that it's very typical from Bolivia, it's very hybrid in the way of how different ways of thinking have influenced this culture. On one way, planners organize these spaces of participation where they include authorities and they include citizen representatives in order to define how the municipal budget is going to be expended. But at the same time, next slide, they maintain a very more technocratic planning way of thinking, sustaining binaries and categorizations that are not only reductionist, but also that create power imbalances. And with this, I refer to the categories urban and rural, informal and formal, academic and citizen. So on the parallel, as planners do their participatory and formal way of planning, in the informal settlements, citizens carry on another kind of processes that influence also the results of how the city is being made. So on the side of the citizens, next slide, through informal and insurgent practices, Communities organize very regularly in massive meetings that last a long time, and these are influenced by their indigenous culture and indigenous ideas of what participation and planning is, but also by syndicalist practices that come from very old times in Bolivia. Next slide. So in this way, informal settlements that are pretty much the product of immigrant fluxes sustain their customs and traditions, and they keep their indigenous traditions alive, like you see in the first picture where they are. That's a very common practice of offering some tributes to Mother Earth, and happens every month in these informal communities, but also to organize themselves in communal work to provide themselves of water network provision, or to improve their roads or build the schools. And at the same time, they use these self-organization strategies to make themselves be heard by the local government, whether in more pacific types of protests or more violent, as you can see in the picture on the right. These strategies and the actions taken by planners and the actions taken by the citizens have created a culture of participatory planning that has been clientelist and has produced more poverty, more inequality between citizens, social conflicts between citizens, but also between citizens and the planners, and a lot of segregation between people who live in the urban and the peri-urban and the rural areas. This has been seen as a problem for a long time, and recently, well, more or less recently, Evo Morales' government tried to change the situation by making a whole new legislation and a whole new model of participatory planning that is based on the indigenous ideas and practices, acknowledging that most of the population in Bolivia has still their indigenous roots. In my research, I investigated how this new legislation that was placed in force in 2016 gave different results in planning and in dealing with informal settlements. And unfortunately, in practice, it was seen that the same challenges persisted, although the legislation has been formulated locally, and there has been included a lot of indigenous perspectives into it. And what was missing, next slide, please. And the problem that I see is that a lot of these binaries were still kept, and this conventional way of looking at land and people was still kept, like urban and rural and no formal recognition of these more vastly peri-urban areas that are actually 70% of what the city is, and many cities in Bolivia are made of. This very strict way of seeing at informal strategies as something that need to be punished instead of something that should be promoted as collaboration. This very power imbalance between what is a professional on academic and a citizen and their experience in the ground, and what is to be the authority and what is to be the citizen. So what was missing, what my research could contribute to is that although there was a lot of efforts of making a more context-sensitive planning model, this failed into recognizing that informality and insurgency are part of how the city is made today in Bolivia. So in order for to have context-sensitive planning processes, planners need to be aware that context is changing all the time and need to be responsive to that change. It also needs a more holistic point of view in terms of being innovative in the way how we see the things we do in planning today, and be open to alternative ideas that challenge the conventional ways we have been doing urban planning since the beginning of times, let's say, in terms of participatory planning. And yeah, that's something, that's what I wanted to share with you today. And I finish with this image of peri-urban Sacaba.
Thank you, Paula. I'm going to hand straight over to Johan and Chris now because we are running slightly behind, and he will share his screen with his own presentation.
All right. I'm sorry, can you see that all right?
Yeah, you're not in presentation mode there, Johan. We can see your notes.
Okay, sorry. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. Thanks, everybody, and good morning. Thanks, Salma, Donovan, Paula, really interesting presentations. Been really kind of setting everything up for me very neatly here, so I'm really appreciative of that. I'm going to talk today about a study that kind of titled here, Co-produced knowledge through narrative-based approaches and how that can support transformative climate adaptation. This is comes out of research that I've done with a colleague of mine, Gina Vogel, as part of her a research project that she's running at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town on urban resilience and water governance in Cape Town. And this research really comes out of an interest in looking at how climate adaptation can be leveraged for addressing both environmental and social concerns at the same time. And the reason for this, or the context, is really kind of the Cape Town that is coming out of what some of you might have heard of, the sort of the day zero drought that happened between 2015 and 2018, where the city almost ran out of water and many were threatened by the prospects of having to queue for water at public taps. And we felt the need to kind of broaden the story of what that crisis was about, and kind of draw attention to the fact that many Cape Townians were already struggling with various types of water crisis, be it queuing at taps in informal settlements or struggling with flooding and so on. And what we were asking was basically, what does climate adaptation entail for residents in informal settlements and low-income areas who are often already coping with environmental injustice and legacies of inequality, as is very much the case in Cape Town and other South African cities. And we approached this through a partnership with a group of local activists that have been working with water issues in Cape Town for the past 20 years, and started from a kind of transdisciplinary perspective, where we kind of really sought to mutually recognize what interests each party had and how and where those overlap and do not overlap. And basically, we as academics wanted to understand better what the water issues were in low-income areas of Cape Town, and also to find ways to support community organizations working on these issues. And the activists that we worked with, their interests were to generate viable data that they can use in their advocacy work, and also to develop internal capacity to conduct studies themselves, because they had done very little of that before. So they had that interest going into this collaboration. And together we identified a tool called SenseMaker, which is a narrative-based approach where you basically ask respondents to share a story, and then also to tell you what their story means. So you invite the respondent to sort of code the story that they have shared, and instead of kind of sitting at your desktop and trying to make sense of the data, you invite the respondent to do that, to be part of that process as well. And just to briefly mention kind of how that worked, Sorry, I'll show you this slide. So we developed the method and the kind of interview protocol jointly with these activists, and they then collected stories in the communities where they live, so over 300 stories in total. And basically, this is based on this prompt that you see here. You ask respondents to share a story of when they try to address a water-related problem in their community or where they live. And this then generates both a qualitative component, these narratives of stories, where they explain how water was cut off or there was a leak and how that affected them and their living conditions. And also how they try to resolve it and what happens when they do this. And what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is the collection of the 300 stories in these green dots and how people have coded what happened in their story according to these various options. So you both have this very kind of in-depth qualitative story and these narratives that show a lot of the kind of complexity and interconnectedness of problems on the ground, but then also this quantitative data that gives you a really nice overview of the patterns of different types of problems. And what we saw was often a very widespread sense of frustration among respondents, a low trust in authorities who often fail at delivering solutions, and a very common reliance on informal and sometimes illegal alternatives, because simply going through the formal system takes too much time or doesn't deliver any sort of satisfactory outcomes. So that just touching on the findings, obviously, but more importantly, or in addition to the findings from the project itself, we also found that it was really, really interesting to kind of look at the further learnings that came out of this and the role specifically of knowledge in enacting change. And we really saw knowledge and knowledge co-creation as a really empowering process as well. I mean, both it had a lot of impact on us as researchers, but importantly, we saw how there was also a shift in terms of empowerment of the participants. And there was a shift in their personal agency, in that many participants had never conducted a study before or been able to approach their neighbors in a sort of systematic way and collect data and analyze that. So that was a form of empowerment that we registered. In addition to this, there was also a shift in the collective legitimacy of this the activist group that we worked with, and we saw how they changed in their role of communicating with city officials and so on, and how they were able to use the new evidence and the data that they had gathered to kind of claim a new seat at the negotiating table. And in addition, we also saw a shift in their relational capacity. And by that, we mean how they were able to match their role as expertise, local expertise and holders of knowledge of the situation on the ground with their strategic partners. So both the NGOs that they were working with us as academics and with the city officials. So they were kind of being able to be more strategic about how they interact and how they leverage their different connections. And so lastly, just to say something about why this matters. Well, we argue that in climate adaptation, it's really critical to focus not only on the implementation phase of what you do to adapt to changing climates, but also look at the preceding phase of knowledge creation, which is basically how you describe the problem and what's going on the ground. And here it's really critical to think of what types of knowledge are you drawing on, because that's going to shape what picture you have of the reality and the problems. And here we argue that it's important to not only draw on different types of academic and scientific disciplines and expertise, but also of local experiences and traditional knowledge and sort of the local knowledge that exists, especially in a context like informal settlements. We have the kind of tensions that Paula mentioned earlier. And in order to kind of shift from a more incremental adaptation where you're just kind of shifting, making smaller shifts to adapt to changing climate, by having a more enriched picture of what's going on and the range of problems and how they're interconnected, you're more likely to have a more transformative adaptation where you address both environmental concerns and social needs at the same time, sort of similar to what Donovan was talking about as well, how you can't create new environmental problems when you solve the social ones. The same has to be the case for addressing environmental problems as well. So we found that SenseMaker, the approach that we developed, was a really useful tool for mobilizing this locally held knowledge and linking it to academic expertise to enable advocacy and to change advocacy and change to address more kind of more than climate related issues. Yes, I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Andrew, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I'm going to bring all of the speakers in now so we can start off the panel discussion. So I'd like to have around 30 minutes. I know we're over time slightly, but I'm going to try and bring everybody in now. And I guess what we tried to show with the diversity of presentations there was that the issue of making informal settlements or bringing them into the sustainable urban agenda, the issues are multiscalar and complex. And as we've seen, the issues are different across different countries, different regions, and different contexts. And that's something I want to draw upon in the panel discussion now. And I guess I'd like to kick off with the issue of planning and something that you brought up, Selma, first, the issue of land tenure and land rights, which is considered central to improving the livelihood conditions of people living in formal settlements. However, securing land rights incorporates in some way informality into formal regulating and planning structures, which may then also impact the way people can carry out their livelihoods. So I want to address this question to you in asking, how do we address this duality of ensuring land rights whilst respecting and valuing the contribution of informality to urban life? You're muted there, Selma.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I think that in terms of the literature, when one looks at the duality of that problem is actually what creates the complexity. Because being informal has, if one may put it, quote unquote, has its own benefits. I mean, the informal activities, the informal livelihood, I mean, accessing informal markets and so forth. And I think the real challenge is really to say that can we go beyond policy formulation? I mean, can we try to bring in other partners who can play a role in actually, while recognizing the informality of these stakeholders, but also try to improve the livelihoods? Because I mean, like, and also the experience that was shared by the other panelists. I mean, when Donovan was talking of the housing and so forth, I mean, there could be other partners who could come in and enable these people to upgrade their livelihood because, and I think the experience that Paulo was showing as well in terms of the settlements, people could be upgraded to a certain level, at least so that they have access to the services and they can enjoy a better life. And as a result, they could actually use that to ultimately maybe buy the land they own, but as long as they are classified as informal, which means that the area is not upgraded to a certain degree and therefore it cannot get the formality it requires. So I think the potential solution could be look beyond the two stakeholders, which is government and the settlers. We bring in other stakeholders to play a role so that it's not only policy that dictates development, but for example, in Namibia now they've introduced what is called the Shared Dwellers Association. I mean, so people are forming these groups that can help them upgrade. But the challenge is, I mean, even when I was talking to the city council, is that if you have to bring a road into those informal settlements, I mean, infrastructure to improve these livelihoods, you might have to either demolish some of the shacks or you have to, so it's more than just saying policy. And I think the dilemma of policy is because government is actually stuck with policy and implementation becomes a challenge. So I think opening up for the private sector, especially access to credit, and access to other services while people Yeah, and one of the researchers, in fact, what I read is saying the informality classification is what is a problem. Make informality formal. I mean, make it sound good instead of referring it to as informal. Yeah.
Thank you, Salman. I think that flows nicely into if we move to Donovan and we look at these regulatory environments and talking about private finance and external actors coming in as well as policymakers. What challenges does this pose for private sector finance and private finance working to create housing solutions, this issue of non-formality or informality? What can policymakers take and learn from the lessons and experiences as well from your organization?
I think Selma sort of raises a really interesting point. And, you know, part of its discourse and narratives and the framing of people and problems, which it impedes the solutions which we can bring to our thinking and to our actions. And I think, you know, just building on what Selma just said there, I mean, if you stop talking about the informal sector and start understanding that the informal sector is in fact the private sector, then you see it in a completely different way. Then you say that, well, no, it's not that 80% of people in such and such country work in the informal sector, but 80% of people work in the private sector, but they just work as private individuals or family-based enterprise and what have you. Just on that very reframing, you think about, well, you think about it in a much more seemingly positive way, right? Creative way. Well, how can we invest in that private sector in which 80% of people are working in? Rather than saying, well, how can we, you know, either formalize it or regulate it or squash it out or what have you. So, and this is the case in terms of finance as well. As long as we have these binaries, we're going to limit our possibilities. And we're simply, one of the problems with the planning impediment that we can see, I think we can see movement in terms of an understanding that, you know, to unlock the finance that's required to support the SMEs that are developing to meet local needs and what have you. You know, there are specific policy impediments and planning impediments which we need to move beyond. And until we do, we just limit the possibilities that we have. We limit the opportunities to change that we have. We certainly limit the investment opportunities, but we also limit the possibilities of poorer populations investing in their own futures. And we know that they are most reluctant to do so if there's simply no policy carrot or opportunity at the other end of it. That, well, why would I invest in my wash infrastructure or my house if it is always going to be seen as an illegal occupation and I don't ever have access to this land in any kind of legal or other sense. So I think that one of the problems that we have is that when we're essentially trying to solve a major global crisis in affordable housing with one hand tied behind our back, because we're not really unleashing the potential for either participants in themselves in their own lives, but also we're minimizing the opportunities for other partners to become involved in solutions. So I think that that's one of the things that we're struggling with at the moment, and we can't go to scale with what we know will work simply because there are these key policy barriers. But on a positive sense, I do see, you know, whether it's recently Pakistan through the Naya housing program, seen affordable housing and affordable investing in affordable housing as a key policy priority. Obviously Kenya with its Big Four approach, including affordable housing. So I think there is an understanding there. And maybe if we can leverage those positive policy and planning shifts and demonstrate the opportunities that they create, we can help other countries see what the pathway is.
Great, thank you. And that flows actually nicely into this question for Paula. When we talk about these different planning approaches and positive approaches to planning, you and your research look at hybrid planning in the context of Sakiba. But in your research, you find that even with these new approaches, the introduction of legislation and planning that incorporate local communities and local ideas into planning is still constrained to some extent. What learnings can we take from your research in particular for taking forward this more positive approach to participatory planning, and how do we overcome the implementation of these, the problems with implementation for these practices?
Well, in the first place, the first learning that is not only for Bolivia, but I think it's been visible in other parts of the world, is that a true change needs to be beyond the discourse. And even though there was a good effort in terms of changing the legislation, little has been done in order to make sure that planners and citizens had the tools and the capacities and the spaces in which to where to implement these new ways of seeing things and think differently from what how the planners have been thinking for a long time. So I think what is needed is more dialogue, like in the sense of having continuous dialogue in order to create new ideas and create new possibilities to collaborate and envision how the city should be growing and what is right and what is, and overcome these dichotomies of seeing what is right and what is wrong, but trying to complement all the strategies that have been being developed in the city in order to create an alternative way of planning and participating and making more equal opportunities for everyone living in the city.
Thanks, Paula. And if we move over to Johan, then and drawing on that theme of participatory planning, and in your research, you highlight that a lot of the interventions for informal settlements, especially in relation to climate adaptation, fail to grasp the complexity of the realities on the ground. And you use this idea of storytelling as an important way for informing policymakers and planners and different people working with these issues. Why is that like a good way forward, and what kind of different information and different context does it highlight on the ground that we can use?
Yeah, thanks. No, I think it actually surprised me when we presented some of this data to a representative from the city of Cape Town. I thought that they would be most interested in the hard numbers and the statistics of like what's going on. But they already have that. They have their kind of customer satisfaction surveys that they run with the yes or no questions and the hard numbers on who has access to piped water and so on. But what they don't have is the kind of more nuanced descriptions of why don't things work? Why do people not just go to the municipal office when they have a leak? Why don't they report it the formal way? Why don't they want to pay their bills? And what the stories and what they really liked about the stories and what they wanted to take with them to share with their colleagues was how people could explain the link between a water meter that is broken and failure to pay one's bill, and how that impacts your relative's health and ability to go to work and so on. And I think, of course, you can't collect stories like that from every single residence, but just having what we're setting up now is kind of a library of stories where you can just show just a broader set of examples of how problems are interlinked like that. And I think that is especially important in informal contexts, where most of the solutions that are otherwise implemented are based on assumptions that we can just take away the informal system right away and replace it with a formal one, and that's going to work overnight. And that's coming into a situation where people have relied on the informal system for years often, and they're used to having that be the one thing that works at least better than the formal one. So unless you have an understanding of what people depend on and what they're used to getting their services from, you're going to have a lot of resistance locally from what the city is, the formal authorities are trying to implement, especially in contexts like South Africa, where there's a long history and legacy of city and authorities abusing or failing its residents.
Right, and I think that moves nicely to this second theme of understanding like the wider impacts that we've already mentioned a lot, that there are issues of poverty and marginalization from both access to resources and services, but also issues relating to livelihoods. And I'd like to ask you, Selma, a bit more of an overarching question. When we look at the kinds of policies that are required and we look at the SDGs, we see a lot of interlinkages, and to create fair and sustainable societies of leaving no one behind, which address poverty, but also issues relating to SDG 11 and planning. How do we bring together these different policy areas of alleviating poverty and building more sustainable urban areas? You're on mute there, Selma.
Yes. Thank you so much. In fact, even research have shown that policy formulation is not really the answer, because the problem when it comes to policy is going beyond formulation. And I think the first thing is a coordinated approach at the government level. I mean, like if I give you the example of the city council in Windhoek, they can easily use an excuse, if I may put it that way, because they are limited in terms of what they can do in the informal settlements. I mean, their role is to ensure that their services provided in either a formal structure, and if people want to move to that formal structure or want it to be upgraded, this is how far they can go. But then they say that, but government is the one that should come up with the policy that address all this. I mean, we can only come up with strategies and programs, but we have to fit within a policy. I mean, and that moving from one institution that without a coordinated approach will always say that I'm only limited up to here. I'm not able to do the next thing. And so when we talk of leaving no one behind, to start with is the access to data. I mean, how many people live in those informal settlements and what type of services do they have access to? Because at least if you can document and take progress of how far you have come, even if it's just a matter of having data to say that at least now out of the 80% who did not have access to water or who used to use a prepaid meter system, now they can do ABC. So I think that in itself, just to acknowledge that there is an improvement in terms of tracking progress. And then the other one is really to say that if you, I mean, some of the services we are talking about is not only housing, but infrastructure. I mean, access to public transportation. If you go to those informal settlements, a lot of people have to walk a distance to even catch where they can catch a public transport, because there are no roads. And if you have to take, like in the Namibian case, because of the small population, people still use small cars, like your sedans for taxis. But if you have to take one there, you are paying 3 times if you go to the formal settlements where a taxi will drop you along the road. So those things in themselves is to say, even just improving the services around the informal settlements, make it easier for people to catch a taxi in front of their shack. I mean, what you call an informal house, to them, that's the home. Make it easier for people to access the services and so forth. That way, at least we can, within the informal context, we can still say that now we are trying to account, take progress of how far we've come, but also to improve the services of these people. Otherwise, the Agenda 2030 of leaving no one behind will never be achieved. And for, I mean, as of to date now, in fact, given the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs, there is no country that is on track to achieve all the SDGs by 2030. I mean, let alone the developing countries now, because their funding and all the other resources had to be diverted as a result of the pandemic. So I think in itself where we are, just to be able to say, can we move from no data, or can we move from no services at all to somewhere, so that we can start taking progress and see whether, even if it's beyond 2030, at least we can move towards improving the livelihoods of the people.
Great, thanks, Selma. And if I pick up on that aspect of the multifaceted nature of the problems in urban settlements, and we look at the different building solutions and housing solutions, particularly that your organization addresses, Donovan, how do we take into these complex infrastructural questions when we talk about access to services and housing and economic livelihoods and things like that into building solutions? And how do you do this at Real?
Yes, I think, you know, we need to understand this. I think we all probably share this understanding to some extent, those of us who have joined today. But I mean, there's not a single meaning around house for a family or an individual. It has a spectrum of being an ends and a goal in itself, and then a means to other ends. And that meaning around the house will be different for a female-headed household than it will be for persons with disabilities, than it will be for working extended families, and so on, and traditional family structures. So we need housing solutions that can respond to that demand and that change in demand. And we can't do that by having a sort of a cookie cutter, one size fits all solution to all affordable housing problems, particularly in the developing world, because it doesn't exist. And when we have tried to do that, it's been a spectacular and expensive failure, and people have resisted and resented those solutions. I think if I was going to sort of summarize and go back to the presentation, it's why I focused on investing in people and place. You know, we need to understand the house and the home within its context, its broader context of infrastructure and services, of rights, and its place in people's lives, and its place in the urban fabric, and what it means for poorer populations to have those housing rights secured, is extremely powerful. And we need to invest in people. We need to not only move them into housing stock, which is, I think, a very limited kind of solution, and invest in them as people, as populations, as communities, to be able to empower them to control not only, you know, the nature of that house, but also what it can lead to. And this is why, you know, we put a very strong emphasis on seeing people as economic actors that deserve an opportunity of access to finance, and not, you know, money sharks or expensive usury finance, but, you know, proper finance which other people in the city have access to, and to be able to close that gap between financial institutions and opportunities and disadvantaged communities and communities that are escaping from poverty. So investing in people, investing in place. And Selma raises the excellent point, which I'll finish on, and that is, you know, we talk a lot about such populations, and one of the reasons I said, you know, all solutions are local is that we have very little data really on who is in this category of, you know, the bottom 40% and what their housing needs are. And something that we have invested in as an institution through our data dashboard and working with partners in the Global South is investing in open source data, and investing in data from the public and private sector and from communities to ensure that we are supporting the housing needs of people in an appropriate way, and we understand what their needs and expectations are around housing. Filling that data gap, I think, is a very significant thing in itself, and not only filling it, but also sharing and using that data to inform policy and practice as well.
Great, thanks, Donovan. I see we're coming to the end, but I just wanted to take a comment from each of you on the kind of future outlook, and something we didn't really pick up on, but which I think is quite important is, as we go into COP26 as well, is the impacts of climate change. And I just want to turn to Johan, and I know your research picked up on at the end there about climate adaptation. If we look at the next 10 years, in particular in the context of South Africa, what are going to be the impacts of climate change on informal settlements, and what are kind of the important things we need to take into consider to adapt these communities to the impacts of climate change?
Well, I mean, I'm not primarily a climate researcher, so I shouldn't say, I can't speak exactly to how, what the climate impacts are predicted to be beyond sort of more extreme weather events and so on, and hotter and drier. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's a sort of known for a long time that in places like Cape Town, and I think in many informal settlements in South Africa, it's kind of the exposure to environmental risk is much greater than in other neighborhoods, and it's kind of a common theme in informal settlements globally, I think. And so yeah, more extremes and paired with the less access to sort of the public infrastructure that is supposed to buffer for these things. I think, yeah, that's what I would say is probably most common. But then paired with these other social issues that we've talked about and development needs, I think it's really it's going to vary a lot depending on the city and the informal settlements, really. So that's why you really need to have this at least based interventions partially on local knowledge and local insights from the people who live there. So I think I'll stop there.
And Paula, just a kind of summary comment from you. We've talked about the southern turn in development planning, and for you, again, in the short future, going towards Agenda 2030, how can we make this a reality in planning, taking a more southern turn perspective, especially when we talk about development in the global south?
Well, I think we need to open ourselves as planners to new ways of developing planning, being open to alternative ideas that come and are developed from the ground, from the interaction with the people, from the experience of the planners, seeing the limitations of conventional models of planning and conventional ways of seeing the city, and overcoming these dichotomies and these limitations we have created, that instead of helping planners to build a better future for the city, it's are constraining and limiting their capacities to create new partnerships and collaborations.
Great. And Donovan, moving to you, if we take the same kind of approach to future outlook in relation to your organization, what are your organization's next priorities for the next 10 years when we talk about achieving Agenda 2030 in relation to informal settlements?
We're also committed to the race to zero and the race to resilience, and becoming a net zero organization through our operations, and supporting our partners in developing countries, also our build partners and our developers, and shifting towards a lower carbon set of solutions, and also identifying really exciting innovative SMEs in particular, which are emerging globally, and supporting them, financially and also through capacity, so they can start to fill these needs and these gaps. I think that's something that we're doing on the ground, and I think at a higher level, really trying to, Glasgow, particularly COP26, will be so critical in terms of a recommitment and also a greater commitment through new NDCs in terms of more aggressive actions to be taken. And I would really like to see housing infrastructure and affordable housing in particular on the agenda much more firmly going forward, because we're talking about a 3 billion person deficit of housing needs by 2050. Now, it seems to me that it's a bit of a no-brainer that we need to meet that deficit through the least negative environmental footprint as possible, not only in terms of just the built infrastructure, but its access to water, services, transport, and so on. So to me, we really need to put the housing crisis on the climate agenda in a meaningful way, and us as actors to contribute to framing that in a positive way in which we can simultaneously meet the housing crisis alongside the climate agenda as well.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to give the final word to Salma. And you mentioned that previously in a comment that not many countries are on track to achieve their SDG ambitions. And from your own research in Namibia, but also from what you can see, still based on the progress made, what kind of learnings can we take from what's already been done for other developing countries?
Thank you so much, Andrew. And yes, in fact, what is acknowledged in terms of the SDGs, and this goes back even to the MDGs, is a lot of developing countries, especially the poor countries, have made progress in moving from their low base, whatever that low base was. I mean, one of it could be maybe there was no data to report, and also to invest money, because remember, to have data to be able to track progress, you need to do huge research. I mean, surveys like for the national population and so forth. So I think the lessons that we could learn, and especially from the South African situation, where I participated as one of the lead consultants for the SDG country report in 2019, is really to take that coordinated approach among all the relevant stakeholders. I mean, not only government, but also civil society. And also not only report at national level, because what is happening many a times is that, I mean, we are talking of informal settlements. It's a local issue. It's happening at the sub-regional, but the data we are reporting is at national. So the skewed reporting of information also leads to not targeting the problem, because then you are not able to allocate the resources to address the specific issues. But I think the lessons learned from this is really to say that in terms of progress, other countries, Namibia is a very dry country, it's a semi-arid country, and water is a main issue. So when you are having this, especially during a pandemic like this, you want to be able to at least ensure that you have the basic services like water and sanitation to be able to say you are addressing this 2030 agenda. So I think, and one progress in terms of maybe because of the change in the political structures, in terms of who was there in 2004 and where we are now, there is a change in terms of what is happening, because at least even local authority themselves acknowledge that those who are leasing plots should not only be leasing with no services, but at least they should be treated differently from the other informal sectors. So I think that is what I can say, that countries are making, they're doing some work, but they need to have resources available to ensure that at least they can address the basic services. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Salma. And I think I'll round up then and say thank you to all of our speakers for their presentations and their participation in the panel discussion. I think we had a really great overview of this very complex and multifaceted topic of informal settlements in the relation to sustainable urban development. And I'd like to just say thank you to all of the attendees for participating and for your questions. And I'm sorry we never got around to taking a lot of them, but I hope that some of them got covered in the questions that I posed to the panelists there. So this webinar was recorded, and we'll try to make this available on our SLU Urban Futures webpage for those of you who weren't able to attend today. And thank you again, everyone. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
So,
thank you, Andrew. Great job. Thanks to all the panelists. Really enjoyed the presentations. Thank you.